The war ended, but the documents never did. For decades, beneath the polished marble of government halls and the brass emblems of military command, a darker archive was kept sealed. Cabinets marked with red wax seals, files stamped Geheime Reichssache, for Politburo eyes only, or classified restricted access, held stories the victors never wanted told. The surface history, the parades of liberation, the treaties, the triumphs, was carefully curated for public memory. But in the locked basements of ministries in London, Washington, Moscow, and Tokyo, a second truth existed. A truth written not with speeches or medals, but with burned villages, erased names, and bargains made in smoke-filled rooms. Each folder carried not only evidence, but weight. Black and white photographs smudged with fingerprints, typed reports with words crossed out in thick ink, and signatures of men who swore oaths of secrecy. These are not stories of glory, but of decisions deliberately hidden from daylight, of soldiers sent to their deaths so codes could remain unbroken, of children burned alive to terrify entire provinces into submission, of priests and diplomats quietly arranging safe passage for architects of genocide, of scientists dissecting human beings in cold laboratories, then selling their data to the highest bidder. This was the war beneath the war, a layer buried so deep that even those who fought on the front rarely saw its shadow. Now, as declassified fragments bleed through the cracks, the silence breaks. What emerges is not just disturbing, it is the forbidden ledger of World War II. Chapter 1. Operation Iron Wolf Mass Executions. In the summer of 1941, as the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, entire regions of eastern Poland became killing fields. Hidden deep in the archives of the Soviet GRU, stamped with the warning, "For Politburo eyes only," exists a classified dossier titled Operation Iron Wolf. On the surface, the file describes an anti-partisan campaign conducted in the borderlands around Lviv and Brest. But behind the bureaucratic phrases lies something more chilling, a carefully orchestrated sequence of massacres intended not to crush resistance, but to eliminate entire populations viewed as unreliable, disloyal, or simply expendable. The documents speak of units from the 9th SS Panzer Division, supported by local auxiliaries, carrying out what were euphemistically labeled bandit suppressions. In reality, the operation became a methodical cleansing of villages, where women, children, and the elderly were targeted with brutal precision. The records were never meant to see daylight. Yet fragments, rescued from Soviet vaults in 1991, paint a picture of a systematic terror campaign, deliberately obscured by layers of military jargon. The first pages of the file describe reconnaissance flights, carried out by Luftwaffe aerial divisions in July 1941. Their purpose was not merely to locate Red Army positions, but to identify villages accused of supplying food or shelter to partisan groups. Once marked, these communities were listed under Priority Red. Orders were transmitted through encrypted Enigma communications, later decoded by Soviet intelligence and catalogued in Cipher Intercept 2471B. What followed was a grim pattern repeated across dozens of settlements. SS detachments would arrive at dawn, sealing the perimeters with machine gun posts. Civilians were rounded up, often driven into barns, schools, or churches. Witness accounts, later collected by Soviet NKVD investigators, describe soldiers dousing the structures with fuel before setting them alight. Entire populations were burned alive under the pretense of rooting out resistance. Those attempting to flee were cut down with rifles or bayonets. The survivors, few as they were, bore witness to atrocities. Hidden beneath the bland label of counterinsurgency, 1. Striking testimony appears in an NKVD transcript marked Case File 109K. It records the words of a peasant woman from the outskirts of Lviv, who recalled how German soldiers dragged her husband and 2 sons into the central square, accused them of being partisan collaborators, and executed them against a wall plastered with propaganda posters of the Führer. The woman, left alive only by accident, described hearing the screams from barns where children had been locked inside. The NKVD agent who took the testimony noted that her hands shook uncontrollably throughout the interview, and the file is marked with smudges where tears soaked the paper. Soviet investigators exhumed shallow mass graves nearby, uncovering hundreds of bodies. Many showed evidence of bayonet wounds, suggesting executions at close quarters rather than the firefights claimed in German reports. Photographs of the pits, stark and grainy, were stored under Annex D of the Iron Wolf dossier. Few of these images were ever shown publicly, suppressed on Stalin's direct orders. The scale of the operation grew in late August 1941. Field reports intercepted by Soviet radio units indicate coordination between Wehrmacht, command and Gestapo officers stationed in Lublin. A telegram labeled Gestapo File 17A outlined procedures for total pacification. This meant not only the destruction of villages but the deportation of any survivors deemed useful for forced labor. The file describes transport convoys heading westward, their destinations left blank, though subsequent documents suggest many were sent to camps in the general government territory. Those not deported were systematically eliminated. Soviet intelligence cross-referenced the convoy routes with aerial reconnaissance, mapping a trail of blackened ruins stretching from Lviv to the Bug River. Each burned settlement became a silent marker of an unspoken strategy: eradicate resistance by erasing the communities from which it might spring. One particularly disturbing entry in the dossier details an action near the village of Dobrosin. German records describe it as a successful anti-partisan operation. Yet Soviet exhumations found no weapons among the 312 bodies unearthed. Instead, the victims were overwhelmingly women and children, some as young as 2 years old. Soviet officers noted that many were bound at the wrists with wire before execution. The document, marked with Stalin's personal notation "Do not release," was shelved indefinitely. In the broader Soviet narrative, atrocities committed by the Germans were acknowledged, but those that complicated political propaganda, especially involving Polish populations, were selectively concealed. The Iron Wolf file was locked away, its existence whispered about by archivists, but never discussed publicly. In the years after the war, fragments of the file surfaced during secret trials in Kyiv and Minsk, where captured SS officers were interrogated under NKVD supervision. Transcripts record chilling admissions. One officer, whose name remains redacted, confessed that the orders came directly from SS Brigade Führer Walter Krüger, commander of the 9th SS Panzer Division. He admitted that the division received explicit instructions to make examples of villages suspected of aiding resistance. "We were told to act with severity so that no one would dare offer bread to a partisan again," he said. His words entered into Trial Record 52M. Yet even these confessions were kept under wraps. The Soviet Union preferred to present atrocities in sweeping terms, blaming faceless fascist beasts, rather than allowing details that might reveal the complex layers of occupation and resistance in contested territories. By the 1950s, Operation Iron Wolf had vanished from official memory. The Western Allies, focused on the Cold War, showed little interest in probing events in eastern Poland, leaving the truth buried in Soviet archives. Meanwhile, survivors carried their trauma in silence, often too afraid to speak under Stalin's repressive regime. It was only with the collapse of the Soviet Union that researchers stumbled upon dusty boxes marked Iron Wolf in the GRU's depositories. Among them were faded photographs, typed orders, and field reports, some still stained with what appeared to be blood. Handwritten notes by Soviet officers complained of unpublishable truths and political unsuitability. Even as these files saw daylight, many sections remained redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out in thick ink, leaving researchers to guess at the scale of what was deliberately concealed. The fragments that survive reveal not an isolated event, but a blueprint for terror. Operation Iron Wolf was not simply about fighting partisans. It was a campaign of intimidation, designed to terrorize populations into submission through exemplary violence. Villages burned, populations annihilated, survivors deported. The cold bureaucratic language, priority red, total pacification, successful operation, masked the systematic killing of tens of thousands. To this day, no comprehensive record exists of the true number of victims. Estimates range from 30,000 to 50,000, but the destroyed villages, many never rebuilt, remain silent memorials to the erased. Their names appear only in faded lists within Soviet documents, often misspelled, their stories compressed into statistics. The truth was not just hidden by the perpetrators, but buried again by those who controlled the archives afterward. Operation Iron Wolf remains one of the least known episodes of the war, precisely because it was twice silenced, first by the Nazis who committed it, and then by the Soviets who classified it. What emerges from the declassified remnants is a grim reminder that war's most disturbing secrets are not always found on the battlefield, but in the locked filing cabinets of those who write history. The truth, long delayed, still struggles to emerge fully, as the documents bleed through in fragments, their smudged ink whispering stories governments once swore must never be told. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the winter of 1936, before the war erupted across Asia and the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army established a covert facility in the puppet state of Manchukuo, officially named the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. It was secretly designated as Unit 731. Buried deep in the city of Harbin, behind high walls and guarded gates, lay a sprawling complex where science and atrocity merged into one. The official cover story spoke of research into sanitation and disease prevention. In reality, it became one of the darkest laboratories in human history. Thousands of prisoners, labeled Maruta, meaning logs, were subjected to experiments so gruesome that even Nazi doctors in Europe never documented their details with such detached precision. The full story was never meant to emerge. Japanese wartime officials burned records as the war ended. Yet fragments resurfaced in declassified US and Soviet intelligence files, and in the testimonies of survivors and defectors. Together, these scraps reveal a program where human beings were used as disposable instruments in a pursuit of military supremacy. Inside the compound, prisoners were subjected to experiments designed to test the limits of human survival. One NKVD interrogation record, Case 2479K, describes how frostbite studies were carried out during the Manchurian winters. Subjects were forced to stand outside in temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius until their limbs froze solid. Doctors then attempted different methods of thawing, rubbing the frozen flesh with salt, immersing it in warm water, or burning the skin with open flames. Many died screaming as the tissue cracked or became gangrenous. Notes were recorded with clinical detachment, listing time to death, degree of tissue damage, and observations of physiological breakdown. These records, later seized by Soviet forces in 1945, were copied and hidden in Moscow's archives, marked with the words, "Do not release, sensitive data." The cruelty was not random. It was systematic, calculated, and written into official research reports, stamped with the seal of the rising sun. Another strand of the research focused on biological warfare. Declassified OSS documents uncovered in 1947 reveal that Unit 731 developed plague bombs, porcelain casings filled with infected fleas, designed to spread disease across enemy territories. Test trials were conducted not on battlefields, but on entire Chinese villages. Aircraft from the Kwantung Army dropped these bombs on rural areas, and Japanese scientists documented the spread of bubonic plague, anthrax, and cholera. Survivors recalled rivers poisoned with pathogens, wells deliberately contaminated, and local populations dying in waves of fever and hemorrhage. The reports, stamped with military code names such as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, catalogued casualty numbers as though tallying harvest yields. The purpose was clear: to perfect the weaponization of disease for strategic deployment against enemy forces, and eventually against cities across China, the Soviet Union, and even the United States. Vivisection was another of the unit's horrific practices. Prisoners, including women and children, were dissected alive without anesthesia. The reasoning was chillingly rationalized. Anesthesia would alter the body's natural reactions, and scientists claimed they needed to observe pure physiological responses to trauma, infection, and weapon injuries. Testimonies gathered in post-war Soviet trials describe subjects tied to operating tables as surgeons opened their chests, removed organs, or infected them with bacteria to study the disease's progress inside a living body. In one case, recorded in Trial Record 52A, a woman was infected with syphilis, impregnated, and later dissected to study transmission from mother to child. The notes are blunt, clinical, devoid of humanity, listing only the timing of infection, fetal development, and pathological findings. These were not the crimes of rogue individuals, but the systematic practices of a division supported by the highest levels of the Imperial Army. Perhaps most disturbing is the fate of the data produced by Unit 731. As Japan faced defeat in 1945, General Shiro Ishii, the mastermind of the program, sought to protect his work. Records indicate that Ishii approached US intelligence with an offer: immunity for him and his staff in exchange for their research findings. Declassified American documents confirm the deal. Files labeled Fort Detrick Acquisition show how the United States quietly shielded Ishii and his subordinates from prosecution during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Instead of facing justice, they were relocated, their findings used to advance American biological warfare programs during the early Cold War. Soviet prosecutors, furious at the betrayal, presented their evidence at the Khabarovsk trials in 1949, where captured Japanese officers testified in detail about the atrocities. Yet in the West, these trials were dismissed as propaganda, and the testimony was buried in Cold War secrecy. The result was silence. The victims' suffering was traded for scientific data, their stories sealed away by both victors and vanquished. Documents from the Khabarovsk proceedings reveal chilling numbers. More than 3,000 prisoners are estimated to have died inside the compound itself, while tens of thousands more perished in field experiments across Manchuria. The experiments extended even to Allied prisoners of war. American airmen captured after bombing raids in 1945 were reportedly sent to Harbin. While official US records deny their fate, Soviet files list them among those dissected alive in Ishii's laboratories. Their families received no answers, only the silence of classified files. When researchers in the 1990s attempted to uncover the truth, they found archives still locked, records still redacted, and officials unwilling to confirm what had long been whispered in survivor testimonies, that even American soldiers had been consumed by the machine of Unit 731. Visual descriptions from the surviving photographs amplify the horror. One Soviet intelligence officer described stacks of jars containing preserved human organs, each labeled with a number and the date of death. Photographs showed dissection rooms with blood-stained tables, surgical tools neatly arranged as though preparing for ordinary medical research. But the subjects were not patients, they were victims. The imagery is cold, industrial, efficient. The lighting in the photos is stark, the shadows long, giving the rooms the appearance of execution chambers disguised as laboratories. The atmosphere, as described by one surviving technician, was silent, except for the scratching of pens and the faint moans of the dying. These descriptions were never intended for the public. They were written as intelligence notes, captured, translated, and sealed away. Unit 731 was not alone. Sister units existed, such as Unit 100 in Changchun and Unit 1644 in Nanjing, extending the network of biological experimentation. Together, they formed a hidden empire of atrocity, stretching across occupied China. Yet it was Unit 731 in Harbin that stood at the center, both geographically and symbolically. Its walls contained not just victims, but a vision of war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with microbes and scientific cruelty. The secrecy surrounding its legacy ensured that most perpetrators lived out their lives in freedom. General Ishii himself died in 1959, never facing a tribunal. Many of his colleagues went on to occupy prestigious posts in post-war Japan, some even teaching medicine in universities. Their victims remained nameless, their graves unmarked, their suffering reduced to pages of data filed away in military cabinets. The forbidden experiments of Unit 731 remain one of history's most disturbing buried files, precisely because their truth was not merely hidden, but deliberately traded. Justice was sacrificed on the altar of Cold War strategy. The United States and the Soviet Union each sought advantage, each willing to silence atrocities if it meant gaining knowledge of biological warfare. Today, the surviving documents scattered across declassified American intelligence, Soviet trial records, and Japanese archives remain fragmented, often contradictory, sometimes redacted beyond recognition. Yet together they reveal the full scope. That in the pursuit of war, science was weaponized against the very essence of humanity, and that the silence surrounding these crimes was as deliberate as the crimes themselves. The victims of Unit 731 were not simply erased by death. They were erased again by secrecy, their stories buried in files stamped with words no civilian was ever meant to see. Chapter 3: Churchill's Abandoned Convoy Betrayal. In June of 1942, the Arctic Ocean became the setting of one of the most haunting betrayals of the Second World War. Known to historians as Convoy PQ-17, this flotilla of merchant ships carried tanks, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and essential supplies from Iceland to the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk. But hidden within the archives of the British Admiralty, under cipher designations such as Naval Document 91B, lies evidence that the disaster which befell this convoy was not merely a tragic miscalculation. Instead, it reveals a chilling decision taken at the highest levels of Britain's war command. On July 4th, 1942. While the convoy was en route through the icy waters of the Barents Sea, orders arrived from London instructing the escorting warships to withdraw. The merchant vessels, stripped of their defences, were commanded to scatter. The justification was the supposed threat of the German battleship Tirpitz lurking in Norwegian fjords. But declassified files, smuggled diaries, and intercepted German communications suggest that the decision was made not only out of fear of the Tirpitz, but to safeguard Britain's most valuable secret, the Allied ability to intercept and decode German Enigma transmissions. In the calculus of war, the convoy was abandoned to its fate, sacrificed for intelligence that Churchill believed was worth more than men or materiel. The disaster unfolded with brutal precision. Once the escorts withdrew, the convoy became easy prey for the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine's U-boat wolf packs. German dive bombers launched from airfields in northern Norway descended in waves, dropping bombs that turned tankers into infernos. Submarines stalked the scattered vessels, their torpedoes striking one after another in the icy waters. Survivors' testimonies, later suppressed by MI5, describe flames spreading across the oil-slick surface, the night sky glowing red as ships erupted into fire. Men who leapt into the water found themselves trapped in freezing seas, their cries fading into silence within minutes. One diary, confiscated from a sailor who survived the sinking of the SS Paulus Potter, recorded, "The sky was filled with fire. I heard men screaming for their mothers as the sea swallowed them." The order to scatter was not just death, it was betrayal. The diary was filed under restricted, do not circulate, its contents, deemed too damaging to morale and to Britain's reputation among its allies. Soviet archives corroborate the scale of the catastrophe. Reports sent to Moscow detail that of the 35 merchant ships that set out, 24 were lost. Entire cargoes of tanks, ammunition, and food, desperately needed by Soviet forces fighting the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, sank beneath the waves. Stalin, furious, accused Churchill of treachery. Cables marked Kremlin File 8112A reveal heated exchanges between Soviet and British leaders, with Stalin demanding answers for the apparent abandonment. Churchill, in his memoirs, would later frame the decision as a defensive measure against the Tirpitz. But German naval logs show that Tirpitz never sailed. The threat was phantom, yet it justified an order that condemned thousands of sailors to death and crippled Soviet trust in its allies for years to come. The Admiralty files reveal layers of secrecy. Naval cipher room transcripts, partially declassified in 1978, show that British intelligence had already intercepted German communications, suggesting Tirpitz was not preparing to attack. Yet the order to scatter was issued anyway. Historians who gained access to fragments of Document 91B argue that the true motive was fear that if Tirpitz engaged and sunk Allied escorts, the Germans might suspect that their naval codes had been broken. Protecting the secret of Ultra, the Allied decoding of Enigma messages, was judged more important than protecting the convoy. The result was calculated silence. Official communiqué described the disaster as the unfortunate consequence of enemy superiority, omitting the fact that the convoy was deliberately left defenseless. Personal accounts from survivors deepen the sense of betrayal. Letters seized by MI5, written by merchant seamen to their families, speak of their despair at being ordered to scatter. One sailor from the SS Empire, Byron, wrote, "We were lambs sent into the slaughterhouse. The escorts steamed away and left us to burn. I have no faith left in those who command us." These letters never reached their recipients. Instead, they were stored in secure files, marked as sensitive to public morale. Many survivors who returned were pressured into silence, told that speaking of their ordeal could be considered a breach of the Official Secrets Act. Their trauma became invisible, hidden behind patriotic narratives of unity and sacrifice. The consequences of the betrayal were not limited to lives lost. The Soviets, already suspicious of Western intentions, used the PQ-17 disaster as proof that Britain was unwilling to shoulder equal burdens in the war. NKVD files reveal that Soviet propagandists circulated stories of the convoy's abandonment among Red Army troops, stoking distrust of the Allies. Though Churchill continued to send aid, the shadow of PQ-17 lingered, deepening the fissures that would later define the Cold War. Soviet interrogators during the Nuremberg trials even questioned German naval officers about the convoy, seeking confirmation of British duplicity. Yet these inquiries were downplayed in Western records, buried beneath layers of denial. The material loss was staggering. Tanks intended for the defense of Stalingrad never arrived. Ammunition that could have fueled Soviet offensives lay at the bottom of the Arctic. Food that could have sustained soldiers and civilians was gone. The Soviet files note bitterly that the blood of our people will be spilled because of British cowardice. Yet in the Admiralty's internal communications, the disaster was framed in strategic terms. Protecting Ultra, they argued, had saved countless more lives in the long run. The men of PQ-17, their ships, their cargo, their suffering, became nothing more than collateral in the mathematics of war. To this day, questions remain unanswered. The full version of Naval Document 91B has never been released. Large sections remain blacked out, entire paragraphs concealed under national security restrictions. Researchers who have seen fragments describe them as damning, suggesting foreknowledge of the convoy's destruction. Survivors groups have long demanded full transparency, but successive governments have refused. The truth remains buried under layers of classification. The betrayal acknowledged only in whispers. In the end, PQ-17 was not just a naval disaster, it was a deliberate act of sacrifice, a decision written in cold ink on Admiralty paper, carried out on the backs of ordinary sailors who were left to freeze, burn, and drown in the Arctic night. Churchill's abandoned convoy is remembered today in fragments. Rusting hulls at the bottom of the Barents Sea, survivor testimonies that surface in faded letters and diaries, and archival files with blacked-out lines that hint at truths still untold. It remains one of the most disturbing chapters of the war because it blurs the line between strategy and betrayal. The men of PQ-17 were not defeated by German firepower alone. They were betrayed by their own command, sacrificed in silence to preserve a secret that the public was never meant to know. Chapter 4. The Vatican's Secret Ratlines Network. In the shadow of the war's end, as the Allied armies liberated cities and the world prepared to judge the architects of genocide, a parallel network was already in motion. Between 1945 and 1948, thousands of Nazi officials, SS doctors, and war criminals vanished from Europe, slipping past Allied patrols and international tribunals. Their escape route was not chaos nor accident, but a carefully orchestrated operation known today as the Ratlines. Hidden in Vatican diplomatic cables, marked restricted, not for circulation, the network was shielded by clerical robes, Red Cross passports, and silent nods from sympathetic governments. At its heart were safe houses scattered across Rome, Genoa, and other Italian cities. Monasteries and religious institutions where fugitives found sanctuary before being funneled across the Atlantic. The story was long dismissed as rumor, but declassified CIC reports, Argentine consular files, and intercepted MI6 correspondence prove otherwise. What emerges is a disturbing record of how the Vatican's humanitarian missions blurred into complicity, enabling some of the most notorious figures of the Third Reich to find refuge under the guise of Christian charity. The logistics of the Ratlines were precise, almost bureaucratic. At the center was Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico in Rome, whose name appears repeatedly in US Counterintelligence Corps documents. CIC Report 1327C describes Hudal's role in distributing falsified identity papers to fleeing SS men. With Vatican backing, the International Red Cross issued temporary travel documents, Red Cross passports, to men whose real names were carefully omitted. One such passport, preserved in the archives of Buenos Aires, bore the false name Ricardo Clement, a cover that allowed Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, to board a ship to Argentina in 1950. The paper trail is unmistakable. The passport carried an official Red Cross stamp, a forged Austrian birthplace, and a signature made in Hudal's distinctive hand. Documents like this transformed some of history's most infamous criminals into ordinary emigrants, vanishing into South America's immigrant waves. CIC surveillance files reveal how monasteries served as safe houses. Reports filed in 1946 describe fugitives being hidden in the Collegio Teutonico, a German seminary just meters away from St. Peter's Basilica. From there, they were escorted to ports in Genoa, often under clerical escort. British intelligence, frustrated by their inability to seize suspects, complained in Operation Safe Haven memoranda that Catholic intermediaries were obstructing arrests. One MI6 officer wrote bitterly, "Each time we approach, the fugitive has disappeared behind the walls of a convent. By the time we locate him again, he is aboard a ship to South America." These memoranda, partially declassified in the 1980s, expose how Allied attempts to dismantle the Ratlines were quietly undermined by diplomatic immunity and ecclesiastical protection. Argentina became the primary destination. Files declassified from the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, labeled Immigration Dossier 47B, show that Juan Perón's government actively welcomed European fugitives, seeing them as valuable technical experts and ideological allies. Through intermediaries in Rome, arrangements were made for entire groups of ex-SS officers to be settled in Buenos Aires and Córdoba. In exchange, Argentina gained skilled professionals, while the fugitives gained new identities and lives. Among those who arrived via these routes were Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, and Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Each traveled under falsified names, their true identities concealed behind forged documents issued in Europe and validated by Latin American consulates. By the time Allied investigators caught their trail, they were already embedded in South American society, shielded by distance, sympathetic regimes, and the Church's silence. The Vatican's precise involvement remains shrouded in secrecy, but the documents that survive suggest a pattern of willful blindness at the very least, and active facilitation at worst. US intelligence cables note that Vatican diplomats argued their actions were humanitarian, helping displaced persons stranded in war-torn Europe. But as CIC agents pointed out in memoranda, the displaced persons were often men whose names were already included on Allied lists of wanted war criminals. One CIC memo from 1947 states bluntly, "The humanitarian program has become a cover for SS escape operations. This is no accident, but design, whether motivated by anti-communism, sympathy, or a desire to shield fellow Catholics from Soviet trials. The result was the same. Criminals who should have faced justice instead disappeared into new lives abroad." The files also reveal tensions between the Allies. US and British intelligence units documented the Ratlines extensively, yet both governments were reluctant to confront the Vatican directly. Cold War politics played a decisive role. The West saw the Catholic Church as a crucial ally against Soviet influence in Europe. Exposing its involvement in aiding Nazi fugitives risked alienating a powerful institution at a time when the Iron Curtain was descending across the continent. As a result, the evidence remained sealed. Reports were marked, not for release, and the fugitives continued their escape. By the time fragments of the truth surfaced decades later, most of the men had lived full lives in South America, dying in freedom rather than in prison cells. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Ratlines is the way they erased accountability. Files recovered from the archives of Genoa list dozens of names of SS officers who boarded ships under false identities. Names now lost because the records were deliberately destroyed. Survivors of the Holocaust, searching for justice, often found their tormentors had vanished without a trace, their trails disappearing into forged documents and sealed archives. For families who lost loved ones in camps and massacres, the silence of governments and the complicity of institutions added a second wound: the denial of justice. Letters from survivors, preserved in Jewish relief archives, plead with Allied authorities to pursue rumors of Nazis in Argentina. Most received polite, dismissive replies, or no reply at all. The Vatican's Ratlines remind us that the end of the war did not end the machinery of secrecy. Instead, the machinery adapted, transforming into networks of escape. The documents that survive, cables, passports, memoranda, are fragments of a much larger system that operated under the surface, using the language of charity to disguise the facilitation of flight. Many files remain missing, destroyed, or locked away in Vatican vaults under classification. The truth, like the fugitives it describes, remains elusive, obscured by layers of denial and silence. Yet the fragments that survive tell enough: that justice was deliberately undermined, that institutions sworn to morality shielded those guilty of inhuman crimes, and that the post-war order was built not only on tribunals and trials, but on secret corridors where history's darkest men walked free. The Ratlines were not a rumor, they were a system, one carefully constructed, quietly executed, and deliberately buried in archives the public was never meant to see. The war's forgotten files are not only about events, but about silences. The silences governments kept, the silences survivors were forced into, and the silences that history still struggles to break. From the burning villages of eastern Poland, hidden behind Stalin's sealed archives, to the frost-bitten laboratories of Harbin, where Unit 731 turned human beings into test subjects. The documents reveal a shadow war conducted outside the public eye. They speak of Churchill's decision to abandon men and ships in the Arctic, a betrayal buried beneath the language of strategy, and of Vatican corridors where fugitives walked in priestly shadows, escaping justice under the cover of charity. Each file carries with it not only facts, but ghosts, photographs blurred with blood, reports written in coded language, confessions locked away in vaults. These stories were never intended to see daylight. They were buried not once, but twice, by the perpetrators who committed them, and by the victors who decided that truth was less valuable than power. And yet fragments resurface, each declassified page, each survivor's testimony, each rediscovered file cuts through the silence and demands to be heard. The question that lingers is not only what else remains hidden, but why these truths were concealed for so long. History, it seems, is not only written by the victors, it is edited, redacted, and sometimes deliberately erased. What remains is a ledger of suppressed truths, waiting for the courage to read them aloud, even when their weight feels unbearable.